Facebook and YouTube. Don't want to discredit YouTube. It's important too, even if nobody watches it. Facebook land, going live on Facebook. We're going to be live any second now. Any second now, we're going to be live. People are probably already sitting at home watching the Facebook song. Is it still syncing? Is YouTube online already? Yeah, that sounds about right. But Facebook is still taking its sweet time. Facebook song, singing the Facebook song.
I'm liking the vibes of the Facebook song.
It's a good song. Yeah, I wrote it myself.
I mean, it needs a little fleshed out, but it's 80% there. You know.
Don't come to my venue and tell me how to sing songs, Wyatt.
That's true. That's true. Stepping on toes already. Oh boy.
Still sending data? Let's see if it's lying. It's probably lying. We're probably live on Facebook for quite some time now. It lies a lot.
Get a nice delay in there.
Well, technology is notoriously... It says we're live on Facebook?
Oh, huzzah.
We've been live on Facebook this whole time. Everyone's... Thank you. Thank you for the kind words. Hello, everybody in Facebook and YouTube land. Welcome to Collective Conversations. I'm Dexter Carmen, the Executive Director here at the Cave Collective. And I am here with my good friend Wyatt Bills, who has all kinds of things to share with us today. Wyatt is a filmmaker here in the Black Hills. He's a social media expert, does all kinds of marketing stuff for businesses. So I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself and tell us more about your work, though.
Okay, absolutely. So as Dexter mentioned, my name is Wyatt Bills. A little bit about me. As of right now, I do some freelance videography for small businesses, as well as doing some social media management. I also work in live stage productions here in the region, and I have a background in broadcast and doing live streams for sporting events. In addition to that, I am from the area. I grew up in a small town called New Underwood, South Dakota, about 30 minutes away. And I went to college and graduated at Black Hills State University in Spearfish, and have been talking with the Cave and working with the Cave periodically for a couple of months.
Well, yeah,
here and there.
You count the drive aid over a year.
Right, yeah. So periodically here and there.
Yeah.
For sure. So wonderful people here, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to speak with you guys.
Yeah, you know, I was actually just thinking, as I said, the drive aid over a year, that was 2 days ago, 1 year ago. Mm-hmm. And I think I met you at the drive aid, right?
So I have heard about the Cave and about, you and Natasha before that in whispers, but nothing concrete. At that point, I didn't even think that it was a physical location, which at that point, technically, it wasn't.
Right.
But that was sort of my first introduction to the Cave Collective as a whole, and that is where I met you guys for sure, and kind of solidified to me what the Cave meant, and also the potential for growth that it had. And so from then on, kind of was keeping up to date with what was going on, and when you reached out to me, that was probably one of the fastest yeses I could have said in 10 years. Yeah. So absolutely, I'm happy to be here.
There was very little turnaround time for that, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm excited to be working with you guys and all you wonderful people. So.
Awesome. Yeah, so we're going to be talking more about that later on in the program. Wyatt is going to be doing some awesome video work with the Cave Collective here soon. We're going to be trying to amp up our marketing game, which is Wyatt's specialty. And so we reached out to him to ask to help out with that. So we'll be talking more about that, but I want to go back to the very beginning.
Okay.
You're from New Underwood, right?
I am.
And we talked a little bit about this. So what you do is pretty high tech.
Yes.
So how did a guy from New Underwood get into the career that you're in now?
So that's a very interesting question without a solid answer.
My favorite kind.
Yeah, exactly. Got to keep it ambiguous, But long story short, I suppose being born with cerebral palsy and growing up in a small town, I grew up on a dairy farm. My family is farmers and ranchers for several generations. The dairy farm that my parents worked on and my dad helped build and etc. was built by my grandfather. And so that was what my family did. But with cerebral palsy, I knew from a very young age that it wasn't feasible for me to do really labor-intensive work even up until my 40s. So even from when I was really little, before 10 years old, I knew that I wanted to do something that would use my brain more than my body. It was just a matter of finding out what that was. And growing up, I loved sports and live events, and up until about high school, I wanted nothing more than to be a sports broadcaster on the local news, on network TV, what have you. And that was the goal up until probably my junior year of high school, and I interned at a couple different places around the region. I found out that for various reasons it wasn't for me, but I used the skills that I learned trying to prep to be a sports broadcaster, and I said, okay, what can I do that uses these things in a way that's more adaptable to my current situation, and what can I also do to bring kind of an atmosphere to myself that can allow myself to be helpful to others. And so being a broadcaster, I learned a lot of camera techniques. I learned public speaking skills, things like that. Script writing is very super important in those kinds of fields. And going from there, I went into college, stayed on the athletics track because that was where my background was, and I got a wonderful job doing broadcast media for the athletics department at Black Hills State University. And I did that through all 4 years of college, kind of branched out what I could do. And then while also at Black Hills State, I met some great people that were doing freelance videography and photography and things like that. And I used some of my electives to take those classes and just fell in love with it. So for the past 2 or 3 years, I've been going down the line of freelance photo and video. So that's how you get from a dairy farm to here working on social media on a live stream with you guys. So.
Well, that's you have quite the story, and one of the things that we had talked about earlier was your experiences in the high school in New Underwood and the lack of access.
Right.
And that's something you talked about, how you feel that's an important thing that you try to talk about as much as possible, and that's one of the things I like about the cave.
Right.
Could you expand some on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the reasons that I'm very drawn to the Cave Collective as a whole is the open atmosphere that you guys try so hard to provide for everybody. Growing up in a small town, that wasn't necessarily always the case. I never felt uncomfortable with a physical disability because they're widely understood. And to New Underwood's credit, the people made me feel welcome at all times for the most part. Of course, there's exceptions. There's exceptions to everything. But person to person, growing up in New Underwood, I was accepted. And that was fantastic. But what I feel like places in the region need to really prioritize and focus on is general accessibility for people with physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, etc. For example, New Underwood still to this day, and this isn't an insult, this isn't a call out or anything like this, this is just, laying it out there. They don't have what I would consider up-to-date ADA accessibility. For example, they do not have an elevator in the school. and my classes in high school were up 2 flights of stairs. So whenever I would have to go get work done, have a correctional surgery, or anything of the sort, sometimes I would be in a wheelchair, a cast, crutches, however. And so when that would happen, instead of being able to go upstairs into the usual classroom, my entire class would have to reschedule their class and transition the classes that were scheduled to be upstairs downstairs. So because of one person, the entire class had to move and reschedule to a different room. And that was, I had a surgery about once a year. And so that was a pretty consistent thing. And, I was glad that they made the accommodations to make that happen. But also, I felt bad because, I changed the routine for 30, 40 people, the professors, the staff,
Right.
et cetera. So things like that are something that, speaking about it and being upfront about, hey, like, thank you for being accommodating, but in the future, when we build new schools, when we build, new facilities, that needs to be at the forefront of thinking. And I think that every contractor, every architect needs to have a disability advocate speaking about infrastructure and things like that to avoid those issues. And, and New Underwoods High School is decades old, 100 years old. So it's of no fault of their own that they have an old building.
Sure.
But in the future, that's something that needs to be addressed.
That's something that when we were building this space out, we all agreed before we got the space opened up that we wanted to make sure that we were fully ADA compliant. We didn't want anyone to not be able to attend our events due to its disability. That was one big thing. Like a lot of shows happen in the basement where West Dakota Improv used to be, and that was eyed as a potential location for us. But there's those big stairs. It's where Decades is at now, and that's the only way in and out is that one big staircase. And when people who were like in a wheelchair would come to the show, we'd have to get a posse to like go carry the wheelchair down the stairs and back out.
Yep.
And I imagine that on top of the frustration of that experience already, that kind of attention is probably very much unwanted.
Yes. The help is appreciated, but in some circumstances it can be demoralizing. And I've tried to live my life as independently as possible. So when things of that sort come up where I need help, it still makes me feel bad, which I need to work on. Personally, I need to get better at saying, I need help with this, I need help with that. And that's something that, regardless of what you're dealing with, people need to be better at. But when it's something like bringing a ramp out of your store or, your educational institution, it's a little bit degrading at some points. Even in college, there's a couple of examples that I could give, but we probably need to keep things moving. So
Yeah. And that's one of the things that impresses me most about your work is that you are an independent contractor and you're doing all this work on your own. Can you share some about how you feel that your work, both within the context of your lived experience with living with a disability, do you feel like your work dovetails into that? And then how do you feel like that work might impress or impact others who are also living with disabilities?
absolutely. So first and foremost, I will say that I've been fortunate enough to have several people kind of help and guide me throughout this journey. I very seldomly work 100% alone, and nobody, I believe, can be successful all on their own. So I just want to say that all of the work that I've done is partial credit needs to be given to others that have helped me work on those projects and things like that. There's more people than I could list right now.
I know that feeling.
Yeah, but I do want to say thank you to all of them, first of all. But to your question of being independent with a disability and how that guides my decision making, you know, it's an ongoing process. I'm 24 and I still haven't figured out exactly how my disability affects my workflow. And that's another discussion we had earlier today, is figuring that out. And for example, one of the things that I always tell people is never let an obstacle stop you from doing what you want to do. You might just have to think of an unorthodox way to get around it. And, you know, that it's a little bit difficult sometimes, but a quick example of that is I rarely will give a hard deadline for one of my projects I work on with a client, because I have several jobs going on at a time, and say I'm working a stage the day before I have some editing to do. If I overdo it working on the stage, I won't be physically able to get out of bed sometimes and go edit, or things like that. But it's all about communication from the very start, and saying that this is what I have potential to do, but in order for me to do the best work that I can, you have to work with me as much as I'm working with you. So that's key, and that's good advice whether or not you have any sort of disability. Talking to people about what you can do and what your expectations are, but also being upfront about, okay, these are the limitations of my work and what I can do.
Sure. And I think that really dovetails nicely into what we were talking about with self-care.
Mm-hmm.
We live in this 9-to-5 job culture.
Mm-hmm.
And those of us who have entrepreneurial aspirations are often told, truly successful people go to bed at 10 o'clock every night. They get up at 5 o'clock every morning. They go for a run. They have their protein smoothie.
Mm-hmm.
There's like a whole, these are the steps. If you do all these things, you will be successful.
Right.
But that is not a one-size-fits-all model, which they fail to mention often. Can you speak to how your experience applies to that?
Absolutely. And we had small discussions about this earlier, but as you mentioned, particularly in small regions and small areas, and I'd say the United States as a whole really, has grew on a foundation of, like you said, get up earlier than everyone else, work later than everyone else, and you will be successful. Solid advice to a certain extent, because I believe that you get in what you put out 100%, absolutely. Disability or not, to some extent you have to put in the work in order to reap any sort of benefit. But what has failed to be discussed when it comes to traditional success is, like you said, it's not a one-size-fits-all guide to success. Me personally, with cerebral palsy, I burn high amounts of energy. My metabolism is super, super high. My muscles are very tight, and it doesn't take a lot for me to be sore at the end of the day. So because of that, it's doctor recommended that I get more sleep than the average person. It is 100% necessary that I stretch before prolonged physical activity, otherwise I risk injury. And there's a lot of other factors throughout my day that makes the traditional success model not effective for me. My morning routine takes about 30 minutes to an hour longer than it would an average person. So if I wanted to, show up to work early, I would not only have to wake up early, I would have to wake up early enough to incorporate the rest of my routine, and I would have to be waking up at 4 a.m. every morning, running on 4 hours of sleep and with spastic muscles, that's counterproductive, and I would put less work in than I would be capable of in that amount of time. So I guess the advice there is always think about your strengths and weaknesses, how you can accent those, and then be as upfront as possible with any sort of employer or colleague about what you can do, what you're uncomfortable with, and hopefully, if those conditions are met, you can be as successful as you personally can be. And to be honest, there's been some work situations I've been in that haven't made the effort to be as accommodating. And as much as you would maybe like to work for those places, or, however you want to phrase that, I will say that in most cases, fitting a square peg into a round hole is not worth your time and effort, and you will burn yourself out. So you have to be flexible and upfront with your personal struggles, whatever that may be.
Well, and you said something really insightful earlier about how cerebral palsy has been known about for 60 years. Mm-hmm. It's well documented, the research is there, and a lot of the societal stigmas surrounding it have been dissipated because of that. But there are invisible disabilities like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, etc., that aren't so well understood and aren't so readily apparent. And everything that you said so far applies to those just as much.
100%, absolutely.
What do you think we can do as a society to help bring awareness to these issues and make them more societally acceptable?
Well, it starts with exactly what we're doing today. Having open and public discussions about what people deal with. And, things like this may reach a couple hundred people, but 2 or 3 of those few hundred people will reach out and further this discussion, even without our knowledge of them doing so. And in terms of communicating a non-visible disability, like you said and I talked about earlier, having cerebral palsy is, something that the medical world has understood for decades. And to some extent, that is a benefit for me because people can see that I won't be able to be as productive, in quotes, as the average person may be, and so they would be more willing to outwardly adapt to myself. But if I had focus issues or depression, anxiety that mess with my daily scheduling or anything like that, it's much harder to bring that up in a workforce environment because you can't see it. But like I said, same advice applies. If you struggle with those kinds of things, please, before you accept any sort of work, anything, be upfront and be honest with your employer. And if they don't accept those things, it's probably best for you to move on and find somebody that will, because there are places out there that are extremely adaptable and extremely accepting of all types of people, just like right here. And I will give a special shout out to the Deadwood Mountain Grand. I work as a stagehand there. Prototypically, somebody of my build and with a physical disability would not be a stagehand. 20 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. But when I applied at the Mountain Grand, again, I was upfront. I said, this is my resume. I fit the job description, but I struggle with XYZ. Mm-hmm. And from day one, they sat me down and said, okay, we trust that you will do everything within your ability to make things go smoothly, but if you struggle with anything, please let us know. And just that has made things go 200 times more smoothly than it would otherwise, for both me and for the mountain grant.
And I think that's an amazing thing that you've come to have that sense of self-awareness, but also the confidence necessary to go into those situations. That something for me that I don't share very publicly is that for the longest time I had a really bad anxiety disorder. For about 10 years, up until about 2018, it was crippling, and I had always worked manual labor, and those blue collar jobs are often very masculine. A lot of toxic masculinity is involved in the general attitude of the workforce. And so I did not tell people about my disability. And so there was this trend where I would get a new job, I'd work it for a while, I'd meet all the expectations, and then I'd have an episode and I'd get fired because I hadn't talked to anybody about it, and this behavior I was exhibiting was concerning. And with so many times, all those conversations, they always told me, why didn't you tell us about this when you got hired? And I was ashamed.
Well, you know, like I mentioned, with me, it's outwardly obvious. So for me, it was addressing the elephant in the room, which made it 100 times easier to have those conversations because it would be brought up anyway, eventually. In a situation like that, I can't imagine the mental struggle it would have been to say, you can't see this, but my advice still stands, and it takes a lot of courage to do so, is to say, this is what I struggle with. And one thing that, if I could go back in time with my current self and tell you would be, don't be afraid to be that guy and go to management and say, hey, this is not okay. This specific thing made me feel very uncomfortable, and the workforce environment is not meeting the standards that I need to be successful. And keep in mind that the law is on your side. If you're discriminated against because of a disability or anything like that, and it gets in the way of your workflow and they don't make the necessary adaptations, keep that in mind that that's always something that you can do. And if you're upfront about that and you say, supervisor, I really have been struggling with severe anxiety, changes need to be made, and sometimes that starts at the core, at the very culture of some of those workplace environments. For example, you mentioned that you were working lots of manual labor jobs, lots of blue-collar people probably there, and that's where the stigma of work as hard as you can, clock out, wake up, do it the next day, comes in. So again, the best way to fight those is to talk about it. And that's, like I said, for me, it's addressing the elephant in the room. So I have to recognize that it's much easier for me than it would be for somebody like yourself that felt like you would need to hide those things. But it is what needs to begin to happen more frequently, and I hope it is beginning to happen more frequently.
Well, and what you said about the advice I would give to somebody who might be watching right now who lives with an invisible disability, and they might be looking for work right now. And it's understandable where if you are in a position where you haven't had a job for a couple months, bills are coming due, that you know that you might be discriminated against in the hiring process. Because, yeah, once you're hired, they have to accommodate you, but they can not hire you.
Right, absolutely.
And that could, to somebody, be a very a good reason to hide a disability. But I really like what you said about if that's the culture at a place where they're not going to hire you because of this condition, it's not somewhere that you should be working anyway.
Right.
And that sense of respecting yourself, that self-value and knowing that you have worth and someone's going to see what that worth is, and that's where you should be spending your time. Mm-hmm. I mentioned that I had a really bad anxiety until about 2018. When I lost my last job that I experienced really bad anxiety at, I promised myself I'm never working anywhere again that I am subjected to a situation where I feel like I have to hide.
Right.
And so I started going to school and working in graphic design and marketing.
Mm-hmm.
And through that process, not being in an environment that triggered my anxiety every day, the anxiety went away.
Right.
Like,
It's self-healing.
yeah,
It really is. And people don't realize the damage that their work environment can do. And, we had discussions earlier of a lot of the times with mental health, it comes down to bottling things up that you're not even conscious of, and then sometimes it hits you like a brick wall. And a lot of people deal with that on a daily basis. And so doing all the things that you can to avoid putting yourselves in the situations, the better. And, I will state publicly right now, if somebody out there with a disability is struggling to find work, I am always looking for second hands on various different projects, regardless of what that is. And even if I cannot hire you directly, I would be more than happy to teach you some skills to be able to do the things that I do. And so if anyone out there is listening that would like to, learn directly from myself, I would be more than happy to do exactly that. So
that's a really generous offer. I think that's so much of what the cave is about is the idea that we can look out at the world and we see things in this state of chaos and disarray, and that chaos and disarray is reflected within our own lives. And we oftentimes feel like we can't reach out for help.
mhm.
And that's what we believe in so much here is opening up those conversations that you may not find them right away, but your people are always out there and they're waiting for you.
Right.
And I think so many of us live our lives feeling like we haven't found our tribe or our people. And so, as Wyatt did, if you are someone who in life does not feel like you have a place where you can be safe and just be yourself, that's what the Cave Collective is. That's what we do here. That's why this place exists, is to give everyone, no matter what your background, what your abilities are, to feel like you're home. There's always a family here. And that very much comes from my own experiences growing up in Rapid City and how I really found myself in DIY art spaces. That those places they are such vital generators of life and spontaneity. But by their very nature, DIY spaces often close down after a short period of time, either due to financial hardship or issues with law enforcement or whatever the reasons might be. And our model here was very specifically, how can we create a space like that that can stick around?
Right.
And so we try to make it sustainable. That's why we have the coffee shop. We're a nonprofit, so if anybody out there's got some deep pockets and wants to support a great cause, the Cave Collective is always looking for benefactors. And it's really just about creating a space that we needed when we were younger.
Absolutely. And I might have, discussed these with you beforehand, but this is very similar to discussions that I would have with my twin sibling. Growing up, we weren't necessarily partiers, anything like that. No, like troublemakers, anything like that. And we always said to ourselves, growing up in a small town with 3 bars, a church, a cafe, and that was essentially it. That we always wanted a place that wasn't a bar, that we felt welcome and had activities and people to talk to and have a social environment that's constructive instead of destructive. So that's exactly what this place is. And so, and I funnel people all the time directly here that are looking for places similar to this, because there is a need for places like this, and I will always appreciate this kind of atmosphere.
Well, it's the greatest honor to be a steward of this environment. But one of the things, we've been talking about anxiety this whole time, and I think this is a great opportunity for us to bring up. So, the last year, you talked about bottled up feelings, repressed emotions. That's kind of been the menu for about a year now for all of us, whether you
Yeah.
prescribed to that menu beforehand or not. We've all gotten a taste. Coming out of the pandemic, one of the things that I've really noticed is my anxiety's come back to a great degree. Things like I used to not have any problem, well, like this, for example, right now.
Right.
Generally speaking, I had no problem with public speaking and things like that. And being alone for a year makes you very self-aware. And so you deal with the same thing. You deal with the general public on a regular basis, going to small businesses, setting up contracts, negotiations.
Right.
How do you deal with the anxiety coming out of the pandemic on a daily basis as we segue back into normal life?
Yeah. So I will say that the more experience I get doing that, it never becomes easier. And so the prep talk in the car beforehand is still a very real thing, regardless of however many times you've done that. So I would say coming out of the pandemic specifically, very limited social interaction and kind of curtailing that into jumping back into business meetings and the like is a very difficult and strange process. But the piece of advice that I can give to people is, and it's easy to say, difficult to execute, is believe in yourself and your ability to convince others to believe in you. At the end of the day, if you have strengths and you're confident about them, the other people will see those strengths. So in order to be able to put yourself out into the public eye and pitch your business or an idea or even speak here on a live stream, it's all about just knowing that you have the ability to do whatever it is you would like to do, because everybody does. Everybody does. But as we mentioned earlier, you might just have to take a little bit different path to get to those places. But it's knowing deep in your heart that you can do what you are going there to discuss that will make that a lot easier.
What really makes it a lot easier for me is having a defined sense of purpose of what we are, not, to get kind of quasi-spiritual, I guess, but like what do we exist for?
Right.
That existential angst and trying to say, well, we were created to do this thing. And I think that every single person I know, everyone in this room watching live right now, everybody online watching with us, everyone out in the cafe right now, is really, really freaking good at least one thing. And we oftentimes don't talk about that.
Right. And even if they don't know it,
Right.
That's another key aspect. A lot of people are very talented, but they tell themselves that they're not, which needs to be worked on.
Well, I mean, I can speak to that personally. When I want to make a note, actually. So Mary, who normally hosts Collective Conversations, is actually in the back of the room running the soundboard and the video switcher right now. So thank you for that, Mary. You're doing an awesome job. But 2 years ago, I came to Mary with this idea. We were hanging out at my apartment, and I was like, I want to open up a radically inclusive arts and music venue that has a coffee shop and has live shows constantly. And Mary kind of gave me this look like, okay, if you do that, I'm there with you, but sounds kind of ambitious. And then we did it. And that's what we're here right now. We're sitting in that space that we kind of had no business thinking we had the ability to create, but we knew it was something that had to happen. And so we got together the right people. And that's, that you mentioned earlier, how no one can do anything alone.
Absolutely.
And the whole idea of the cave, it's a collective. It's the cave collective. We are all a part of the collective because none of this can happen without the support of one another. We are a community. That's what communities exist for, is to support one another. And I really just want to encourage anybody watching, once again, find your community, because there are people out there who believe in you, who believe in your dreams, and would do anything, who would move mountains and carve out valleys to help you make those dreams happen. And if you don't know who they are, come down to the Cave Collective, because we're all here waiting for you. It's really difficult, though, to take those first steps. Do you have any advice as to what, personally speaking, I've taken the brute force approach to everything in my life, where I just kind of put my head down and kept ramming forward until the things I wanted to happen happened. It's worked for me, but I'm also 32 and just now reaching my goals.
Absolutely.
You're 24, and I feel like you are much further ahead at your age than I was at my age in ascertaining who you are, what your skills are. What are some steps that you've taken personally to help sort that out?
Well, to that end, I will say that I am very much still in the process of figuring out long-term goals. I don't plan on figuring out long-term goals, at least for the next 5-10 years. But in terms of getting started and getting to where I am today, the best piece of advice that I can give you is, even if what you're into is weird, typically to your environment that you grew up in, even if it's considered weird or there's no jobs available because it's not a doctor or a lawyer or things like that, if you have the conviction to make it happen, you just have to start somewhere. Start as small as you can, and trust me, that's very old, but you have to start somewhere. Make a YouTube video, for example, doing what I do, and put it out. Nobody watches it, fine. But you learn something from it, and then the next time it's going to be a little bit better, and so on and so forth. So again, that's very old advice, but it's very good advice. You have to start somewhere, and even if it's not universally accepted, that's how some of the best ideas in the universe have happened.
Well, it's persistence.
Right.
Persistence is something, there are a lot of talented, lazy people out there, and there are way more successful people who are way less smart than those people who aren't successful.
Right.
Because they were persistent. They followed through, they kept going at it. One of the best pieces of advice I ever received, this is when I was working one of those blue-collar jobs, and I was doing stonemasonry. And we were collecting stones from someone's property to put on the side of their house.
Okay.
For some reason, they decided that they wanted us to clean up all the stones on the property. And they were paying really, really well for the job. So we're like, yeah, we'll go ahead and do that.
Okay.
That seems like a good use of our time. Well, after about 6 to 8 hours of that, it didn't seem like such a good use of our time because we had barely made a dent.
Right.
And the man who I was speaking to, he was very successful, self-made, a millionaire by 20 years old. And I asked him, I'm like, what are we doing right now? Why are we doing this? Like, what is the point of this? Do you really think we're ever going to accomplish this? I was a little upset. And he looked at me very calmly and said, Dexter, do you know how you eat an elephant? And this is not the advice I wanted. I just kind of gave him this look like, how? And he responded, one bite at a time. And that was, maybe it was the heat exhaustion I was experiencing at the time, but that seemed like one of the most profound statements I'd ever heard in my life, and still is, that we, I think, especially in America, we have this big idea that we're going to do one big dramatic thing that changes everything for us.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, that happens sometimes for some folks. But more often than not, it makes less of a story, so maybe you don't hear about it as often. But more often than not, it's people continually trying and oftentimes failing and getting back up again.
Right.
You fall down 3 times, you get up 4.
Right, exactly.
And that's the key to it.
And to that end, I will say that true success in, I'm 24, I'm still a young person that's learning about life, but I've lived a lot of life in a short period of time. And I will tell you that true success is not a number. You can be as successful as a person physically can be and be miserable. So, in my opinion, true success is the ability to look at yourself and say, am I doing what I want to do? Yes. Am I comfortable doing it? Yes. And in my heart, do I think that I can grow doing this and help other people do the same? And if you can answer all 3 of those with a yes, you're probably on the right track. So being able to do those things is more important than any flat number, any arbitrary amount of money, any possession, anything like that. As long as you can work towards that idea of success instead of the material, the happier you will be. Some of the nicest, kindest people that I've ever met have been on their last dime, and I've struggled super hard financially, especially during the pandemic. Thankfully now, things are kind of getting rolling again, and I'm getting busy again. But point being is, even when you're traditionally successful, you can still be miserable. So finding inner peace is more important than finding financial wealth. So,
I think you were just full of great advice tonight, Wyatt.
Thank you.
I really appreciate that. I got a couple more things on this list that we can talk about, but we're getting to about 10 minutes before the end of our talk.
Okay.
So in case nobody has already asked, we do want to open up the floor if anybody on Facebook or in the audience has any questions for Wyatt. Has anybody posted anything?
Blow up the chat.
Yeah.
Please.
Mary's back there. No questions yet? Okay. Well, if you're watching and you have any questions for Wyatt, feel free to jump in. And don't feel bad if you don't have any questions. That's often the case. Sometimes people just like to listen.
Absolutely.
You did say one thing to me earlier about when you love what you do, the quality of your work is so much greater.
Right.
Can you speak to that some more?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I truly, in my heart, believe that you will not be successful at anything you don't enjoy. If you're doing something specifically for the financial benefit of it, you will be a miserable person, as I mentioned beforehand. So finding what you're passionate about and being able to be consistent at it, even if it's not meeting all of your financial goals, material goals, that is more important than anything else. And like I said, as a creative, if your heart's not into it, it will show up in your work. Some of the best work I've ever done has gone nowhere. But I know that that specific piece of footage or that cut or the way that I framed this specific composition was the best that I had done at that time. So I would use something that nobody saw, and then it would come up down the road 6 months, and then I would do it again in a commercial for a small business. So being able to kind of see that your motivations are what push you forward instead of your end goal is very, very important. And like I said, I've interned at places that make you feel like an idea factory. Very concrete structures in how they produce content. And you know, it's technically doing what I wanted to do, but I was still miserable.
Right.
In those processes. And when I look back on, I was only there a handful of months, and I'm not gonna state where it was. But when I look back on what I did, it's subpar to my own standard, for sure. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, it really reflects, but your current work I've seen is really impressive.
Thank you.
So, we talked at the start about how you'll be working with the Cave Collective. So, we are, well, do you want to share with the audience what you're going to be doing with the Cave Collective?
Yeah, I would love to, actually. So here, within the last few, I'd say, 2 months ago is when you reached out.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. So we've been discussing things that I can bring to the cave specifically that would help both grow the cave and myself. One of the things that we discussed is we just talked today about producing a commercial for cable television, as well as a update to our social medias and having specific social media spots for each of the new things about the cave that's updated to a larger update, and that will make more sense when that comes out. But another large thing that was brought to my attention, and I am thankful for the opportunity to do so, is to open up a entry-level video production class at the cave that we are in the process of getting the wheels turning on that. And I am excited and nervous 100 times over to start that process, but it's something that I am extremely excited about and thankful for the opportunity to do. But if that sounds even remotely interesting, please come talk to either me or Dexter, and I would love to start taking ideas to help form what those classes will become. But I will say that the very little that I have set in stone is that it will be very entry level, even making the assumption that what most people will be doing is going to be on a cell phone. So I'm not going to require any sort of fancy tools, any sort of typical filmmaker gear. I'm going to teach it as if you're walking in without any sort of background in photo video. And if you do have a background in photo video, still come to the class, because I would love to help people grow and bounce ideas off of each other, because that's how professionals grow as well, is meeting and discussing with people that have more experience than you do sometimes. And even if that's the case and you're more experienced than somebody else, they can still teach you new things constantly. Teachers learn more from their students a lot than the teachers teach the students. So, yeah, long story short, if that sounds interesting in the slightest, please come talk to me or Dexter, and we will figure some more details out as we get going.
Yeah, I'll second that. We're always open to ideas. I see Mary raising her hand back there. Do we have a question on Facebook?
We do. We have a question.
Yay.
It says, I think some people fear if they turn their loved hobby into a career that they will grow to hate it. And for that reason, people sometimes take more traditional jobs and maintain their hobby on the side. Any thoughts on that? How do you maintain your passion for your creativity?
Absolutely. That is a fantastic question. As soon as you got about 3-4 words into that, I knew where it was going. So that is a very, very valid concern. It's something that I dealt with personally when I first started. And granted, I haven't been specifically focusing all of my energy on this for a very long period of time. But the one piece of advice to keep things fresh, to keep you interested in what you're doing, is again having those conversations with your employer. And this doesn't relate to disability, but it's this similar piece of advice of, if you want me to produce the best quality of work that I can, I have to be able to have creative freedom. And because as soon as you relinquish creative freedom, that's when things can grind to a halt, and you won't enjoy what you're doing if your heart and soul is not into it. And again, that ties back into what we were talking about earlier. So being upfront about what you're doing and what your creative process is another important thing. But completely unrelated outside of the workforce, what keeps me going creatively is having outside hobbies. And that's hard to do when you're busy all the time. But that's another thing that, you need to sort of prioritize and talk about, that, hey, I have a small business I'm working for, but can you give me a week extended deadline because I need a mental break? And, just being able to do those things will refresh your ability to work creatively, and it will keep it from getting stale, in my experience.
Well, and kind of coming off of that, my advice as well is that a big difference is, as you said, when you were working for somebody, it was much harder for you to find joy in it.
Right.
But if you have any entrepreneurial spirit, if you are able to go into work for yourself, making a living, doing what you do fully on your own terms, I find it's much more easy to swallow that pill if you're the one who handed it to yourself.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. That's very true. And to that end, again, come find me, please. Please. Stop me on the street, and that's as honest as I can be. Please come talk to me. And like I said, in terms of being an entrepreneur, that still isn't, I can't do that and pay the bills, still. And I've been doing it for a while.
Same.
Yeah, exactly. So, but applying the advice that I just gave into your other lines of work is how you be happy, essentially. For example, I took this. I was working for the Spearfish Sasquatch, a baseball team in Spearfish, and I managed the media at a local tobacco store, also in Spearfish, called Smokes and Things. And at both of those locations, both of my typical day-to-day jobs, the first thing I told them before I brought on was, I will prioritize my own work. I will. And just being upfront about that and saying I might need to take a week off to go do whatever came up. Mm-hmm. And both of those places were perfectly fine with that, and they still are. The Sasquatch just ended their baseball season a couple days ago, and that was phenomenal. But they were gracious enough, like I said, they allowed me to take an entire week off to go film a concert at the Civic Center. So, again, it ties back into transparency in the work environment and not accepting it if they don't return the favor. That's another key thing. So.
Any other questions from Facebook? All right, well, that was a fantastic question. We're just about to finish up. We just hit an hour. Is there anything else that you want to talk about before we finish up for the day, Wyatt?
Not off the top of my head. I will like to thank everybody here at the Cave Collective. And when I say everybody, I mean everybody. From the bottom up, thank you. Thank you. I would also, like I said, like to reiterate that even in my own work that I've done on my own. It wasn't truly on my own. In fact, I think the concept of being entirely self-made is a faux pas. So the people that have worked with me on the projects that I've been talking about, you know who you are, and thank you. So with that being said, I think that's all I have was a quick thank you.
Yeah, well, I want to do the same thing. I really want to thank you for coming on today. Really
Perfect.
appreciate talking with you. Thank you for all the time that you've given to the cave and just everything we're working on together. You've been such a generous spirit and had so much to offer intellectually and in terms of talent, and we're just really grateful for that. I also want to thank Mary for doing an awesome job on the
Thank you,
sound
Mary.
and the video and all that jazz and relaying questions from Facebook. And then I want to thank our in-person audience as well as our live audience on Facebook and YouTube. We really appreciate you all tuning in. Who's our guest next week, Mary? Joe Barb is our guest next week. So Joe Barb is the president of the LGBTQ Family Connection Center. He's doing amazing work nationwide, but also here in the Black Hills. So that's going to be a super awesome conversation. When I first met Joe, we had a 20-minute meeting scheduled and ended up talking for 3 hours straight. So yeah, I'm sure that that's going to be a really short, to-the-point conversation as well. Yeah, once again, thank you all for watching. And you all get a little bit of an inside scoop on how things work here, because I forgot to tell Mary how to turn off the live stream when we're done with it. So the first thing we're going to do, you ready, everybody? Here we go. Hit that FTB button on the video panel to your right. Where you're switching the cameras at, there's an FTB button on there. You see that?
Fade to black.
All right,
Woo.
fade to black, and now nobody on Facebook can see us, but they can still hear us. So we're going to be really, really quiet while I walk over and kill the feed.
I will not move.